So this morning we're in Hebrews chapter 7. If you guys want to make your way over there, um, I am going to do something crazy here. I'm going to pretty much ignore all my notes. And so this is one of those, I've been struggling with studying this going through chapter 7. And part of it is because I feel like we've been hitting all of this stuff already, and we're just kind of repeating some of these things. But I don't know if that's because of the way I've been studying or if that is truly what's been happening or whatever. But I've been feeling like I'm just down in the weeds. This morning I was just going through it and I was like, I think we're gonna just take a step back and read the whole chapter and kind of take a higher level view of it and go through it much quicker. And so I will warn you that I'm not super prepared for this because I was, like I said, I've just felt like I was down in the weeds and I'm missing the big points here. So we're going to do this. And if you guys see something exciting or something that jumps out and you want to discuss it, make sure to stop and bring us to it and we'll talk about it. But I think that means really that I don't have a good plan for what we're going to do this morning. So we'll just see how this works out. Um, So to start off with, let's just read this whole chapter. We're going to read chapter 7 and we'll go through it. And then after we read it, we'll go back through and kind of hit the verses and pull out some points that we see from each of the verses. When we get towards the end of 7, there's some cool things that happen. But like I said, I feel like this is a lot of repeating. So I just want to probably move through it quicker. So let's see. There's a whole bunch of chunks here. I have one, two, three, four, five, six of us. Five chunks. So let's see. Eric, can you read verses 1 through 4? And then Charlie, can you read verses 4 through 9?
Five,
And
five,
then
five through nine, you mean?
that would be right. 5 through 9. You can reread 4. That's okay too.
That's okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, I have them totally written down in the wrong way. Actually, let's do 5 through 10. And then if this is off, that's all right. But and then John, would you do 11 through 16? And then Dad, would you do 17 through 22? And then Rich, would you read 23 through 28? All right, so we're so just so we're all on the same page. We're reading all of chapter 7. If I got them quite off a little bit and you feel like somebody read too far, just continue on where they left off or whatever.
Got it.
Okay, this is the NASB. All right, 7, 1 through 4. For this is Melchizedek, king of Salem. Well, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest to the Most High God, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham apportioned a 10th part of the spoils, was first of all, by the translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, which is King of Peace. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest perpetually. Now observe how great this man was to Abraham. The patriarch gave a 10th of the choicest spoils.
And indeed, those who are the son of Levi, who receive the priesthood, have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. But he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Now, beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Here mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. Even Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him.
If therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek, and not be called after the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed, there is made a necessity a change also of the law. For he of whom these things are spoken pertaineth to another tribe, of which no man gave attendance at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood. And it is yet far more evident, for that after the similitude of Melchizedek, there ariseth another priest, who is made not after the law, of carnal commandment, but after the power of an endless life.
Where he testifieth, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For there is verily a disannulling of the commandment, going before for the weakness and for the unprofitableness thereof. For the law made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope did, by which we draw nigh unto God. And inasmuch as not without an oath, he was made priest. For these priests were made without an oath, but this with an oath by him who hath said unto him, the Lord sware and will not repent, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. By so much as Jesus made a surety of better testament.
And there were many priests, because they were prevented by death from continuing. But he, because he continues forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. Therefore, he's also able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For such a high priest was fitting for us, who's holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens, who does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins and then for his people's. For this he did once for all, when he offered up himself. For the law appoints as high priests men who have weakness, but the word of the oath, which comes after the law, appoints a son who has been perfected forever.
Good. Thank you, guys. So just wrapping up where we have been. We've been talking about this, how Jesus is in this order, this priesthood order that is different than the Aaronic or Levitical priesthood. It's different, and the author of Hebrews is spending a lot of time pointing out how Jesus as a priesthood is better than the Aaronic and Levitical priests, and this has been interesting. It's been as we've been going through it, but I just want to point out again, there's a lot of cultural context that's wrapped up in this, because he probably could have done this in half the amount of time, and we're all on board. We're like, okay, yeah, I get it. Jesus is the high priest. He's better as a priest than all the others. But the Jewish culture that he was talking to, they were really tied to this whole law and the everything that they had known and the traditions of the priesthood and all of that. So he's really explaining this a lot more than what we might need, but what he is to the extent that they might need. Because we even see in chapter 6 and in chapter 5, he's telling them, hey, you guys really need to listen to this, because you're not going to get it. You guys are going to miss out. And so he's really hammering this point home, how Jesus is not only a valid priest, but how he's better than the priesthood that was set up through the law. And so that's why, so that's kind of where we are. And that's why I feel like we've hit this. He's talked about this a lot already. We've talked about it a lot already. And that's because I think this is probably something the Jews at this time were struggling with. And so he's making a big case for it. And it's probably not as difficult for us to make that jump, because we don't have that tie, that historical context to the law as they do. So as we get through this, just keep that in mind, that this is really interesting. This is a struggle for the Jews to kind of just okay, wait, you're saying the priest can be different than something that I've seen for my entire life and what my family has seen and my parents have seen and their parents and their parents. It could be different. And so he's really got to push that through, help them to understand that. So let's jump in. We'll start at verse 4. We did verses 1 through 3 last week. This week we'll start with verse 4. And again, that he's talking about Melchizedek. So the process that he's making this, I guess we'll say argument, the case that he's making for Jesus as a better high priest, is he's going to talk about first how Melchizedek, the order of Melchizedek, is better than the order of Aaron, and then make the transition to how Jesus is really that final priest in the order of Melchizedek, how he's the one who's going to have this priesthood that lasts forever, which is pretty cool. So in verse 4 and 5, it says, "Now consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. And indeed, those who are of the sons of Levi, who receive the priesthood, have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham." So there's this point that he's making here, which is that Melchizedek is better than the Aaronic and Levitical priests because Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. And one of the points that he's making here is that the Levites, they have to give tithes, right? That's part of the law that they were given, and that's part of the commandments that God gave them. It was a way that he used to provide for the Levites because they didn't own the lands that all the other tribes did. So he had set this up, and he gave the Jews this commandment: you got to pay your tithes, and you pay them to the priests, you pay them to the Levites. But what's different here is Abraham is under no commandment to do that, and he willingly gives up a tenth of the spoils from this battle that he just had, and he pays that to Melchizedek. And so there's this point here that Melchizedek is better in this sense, just because Abraham recognized that Melchizedek was a priest of God, and he did it as an act of worship towards God, completely voluntarily. And that doesn't negate that the Jews weren't doing tithes as an act of God, but maybe they were, maybe they weren't. It wasn't optional like it is here. And of course it's optional. You can reject the law and not follow it, but at the same point, that was God's directive towards them, but it wasn't towards Abraham here. He just offered up this tithes.
Well, don't you think probably after giving tithes for years and decades and longer than that it becomes more rote than it actually becomes ritual? So you just kind of like, okay, here's my 10th. Okay, here's my 10th, and you forget the whole reason why you're even giving it.
Yeah.
And so here comes Abraham, and just because he's listening to communicating with God, like, this guy is a priest, and he recognized him, just did it.
Yeah.
I think that plays a lot into it.
And that is true, right? And you can do something over and over, and it still is an act of worship.
Yeah.
But if it becomes common, then
Yeah.
maybe it's just not as big of a deal. I mean, and you're right. And this is one of those points. I think that's the point of the voluntary aspect that he's pointing out, that for for Abraham, this was completely an act of worship, which legitimizes Melchizedek in a way that doesn't for the Levite priest. And there's another aspect of this, which he doesn't really talk about too much here, but a little bit, which is the fact that there is a lot of ceremony and a lot of things that happen with the priests that they are following because it's prescribed, because it's ceremony, but not really understanding it. But it's different with Jesus because Jesus is the high priest. he actually brings us in to communion with God. I love the previous chapter where it talks about he's the forerunner for bringing us into the presence of God. So there's this cool aspect here, and for me, and he's going to talk about it at the end of this chapter, but that's the big takeaway of why Jesus is better than these priests, which is that Jesus brings us into the presence of God, and the Levitical priests don't. They barely can be in the presence. They can barely get into that. They can only do the Holy of Holies one day a year, and there's the potential that they won't even survive it.
I think again, yes, probably covered before, but to me, this Melchizedek story and the existence of the order is the arc between before the law and after the law. And I actually consider it quite a necessary bridge. And also look at Melchizedek, he transcended the Jews, right? He was Jew and Gentile by definition. And it really is about this is the hard message, and that the law is small, but it was everything around which they were commanded in the covenant. And it's just bizarre. It was part and parcel. It was the focus of their lives, certainly the priests, but everybody in the congregation. And then throughout that, suddenly this thing's central to our lives. It's not just it's even greater than a bridge. It's a tie that never went away. And the law is made small here. And that's why I think it's important, because I think that Christians struggle with the law. In my short career as a Christian, and in the time with people who've been studying the Bible heavily, their struggle with keeping and dealing with the death of the law. I'm using rather extreme terms to express it, but I think it's very common for Christians to struggle with this.
Yeah.
And the logic typically being, if Jesus is the word and wrote every word, therefore every command is Jesus's command, which is not a logic I agree with, but struggled with for a little bit. Then it's, what do we do about these commands? And so, I join you in your pace through this, because it is the overall message of Hebrews.
Sure.
But again, Melchizedek I don't see it as a cultural thing. I think it is it is God's plan that means something to us too. And I don't think it's just a piece of the argument for the Jews, so to speak. It's for everybody.
I see.
It's for everybody, right?
You mentioned the wall. I'm just curious. Are you talking
did I say
about
wall or law?
Yes. Okay.
It
Law.
would have been
Gotcha.
the law. Sorry.
Gotcha. Maybe
my
I
mind nor
heard
my
wall
tongue work well
and-
at this time of morning.
No. Okay, I'm tracking with you now. Okay. Yeah. And I should be clear. I don't. It's not Melchizedek is the culture thing. It's the Levitical priesthood, which is the
Most
cultural
definitely.
aspect. And that's the aspect that they're going to have to shift away from, of seeing this high priest as the answer for atonement, when really it is Jesus who is an answer for atonement. And Melchizedek, as you mentioned, he is this picture and this bridge that has been throughout time, which shows God had a plan where the Levitical priests were not the ones that were really responsible for atonement. They were participating in these ceremonies, but his plan was something different for atonement, and it was not through the Levitical priesthood. And that's where the main point that we want to get from Melchizedek is that God's plan was not to go through Aaron to bring us atonement. It was to go through this other priesthood that is different as he's going to mention, because it is forever. And there's this one central aspect of the Levitical priesthood, which is is very limiting, and that is the fact that all the priests die and they don't continue. And we'll get to that in a couple verses later. But that's a main problem that they have, that no matter how good the priest was, it was going to be temporary. And that's assuming the priest was good. You might be happy if you had a priest who was, taking things from the people and was oppressive. You might be happy that they're not going to live too long. But if there was a great priest, it's still it's temporary. Right. Let's move. This is good. Let's move to verse 6 through 10. So this is really cool. I like this aspect of things. And it says, but he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Now, beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Here, mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them of whom it is witnessed that he lives. Even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak, for he was still in the loins of the Father when Melchizedek met him. So there's two big points here. The first one being that the Melchizedek was, in a sense, greater than Abraham. And we see that because Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And the point he's making here is that the greater blesses the lesser. And so we have Melchizedek in that Genesis 14, I think it's 14, that whole thing that happens. And Abraham pays the tithes and he's offered bread and wine. Melchizedek blesses Abraham. And so there's this cool point that shows that Melchizedek, in a sense, is greater than Abraham. And again, Jews are not going to be, there's some Jews who would be very, very upset at hearing this type of thing, right? Abraham is our father. Jesus was even talking to the Pharisees, and he's like, if you knew your father, they're like, oh, Abraham is our father. That's why we're all good. And Jesus is like, no, that's not your father. And so there's this point here that he's making is that there's salvation isn't going to come through Abraham. It does, in a sense, the Messiah is going to come through him. I guess I shouldn't say salvation, atonement and redemption. That side of the ceremonies that the priest look over, that's not going to come through Abraham. There's something that's greater, and that's Melchizedek. So it's just, I like that picture there of the blessing, of the fact that someone else is blessing Abraham. I like it because I don't have that Jewish heritage. If I was a Jew, maybe I wouldn't like that. I don't know. And then again, he points out that the tithes were paid, and he's pointing out in this logical standpoint, he's saying, in a sense, and I think he even says this again, in a sense, the Levites are paying tithes to Melchizedek because the Levites come from Abraham, and Abraham paid the tithes to Melchizedek. So there's this transfer that happened. We know the genealogy, we know the family of the Levites, but we don't for Melchizedek. And this is an important aspect too, which we'll see in later on, which is that there is this plan for priesthood where family is not the requirement. Your genealogy, where you came from, that's not the main requirement. And again, this is antithetical to the Jews and their understanding of priests. It's crazy. The two requirements for being a priest was that you were a Levite and you were a man. Those were the two requirements. You did not have to be a good priest. We actually see examples in the Bible of those who were not good priests. We have Eli and his sons, and they were terrible. They were taking from the people. There's other examples of priests who were not good priests because that wasn't a requirement, which is kind of interesting, right? That's not the requirement for being a priest. The requirement for being a Levitical priest is where your family is from. But with Melchizedek, it's different. the family is not the requirement for Melchizedek. It is that he is a true follower of, what do you call it? The true and no, the high and living God. No, that wasn't it. I don't remember how he called it. But so this is I like this. I'm gonna take another drink. So if you guys need to say something.
I wonder how this I think Hebrews was written probably before Galatians, right? Because the order of the letters. I mean, I'm not saying Paul necessarily wrote Hebrews, although most people believe that, but from an order perspective, and you wonder if that's the basis of, when Paul says later the law was a tutor to bring us to Christ, and if that was a summary of the main point, to
Yeah.
transition from the law to Jesus, this is sort of the massive dissertation, the PhD level sort of knowledge that
Yeah.
you need to know to really make that jump. Because to say that apart from a book like Hebrews written, it would have been a massive step from a logical perspective, a cultural perspective, as well as probably educational perspective. It's like,
Yeah.
what? Well, I mean, how do we get there? I mean, making an awfully big jump, whereas the book of Hebrews, I think, again, was written before then, at least from a historical, from what we know, sort of gives you the idea of, maybe that's how he got to the Galatian church and said, what are you guys doing after all this stuff was written? And here you are going back to something that clearly is inferior to the priesthood of Jesus. So it's really cool to kind of see how this thing kind of all might have fit together during that time. But again, I don't know all the deadlines and when things were written, but I'm thinking that's probably what happened.
I too, well, I look at Galatians as a companion to this, and not knowing who the author is of this, but without Galatians, I would stumble severely on Hebrews. And I kind of expressed it a little last week in that who's making these claims had better be Paul. That is my reaction, my flesh reaction that says these claims are big and unique, aside from Galatians. But Paul was taught by Jesus, is the way I look at it.
Yeah.
And that I have to look at Hebrews as, and I'm just telling you my general reaction to the book as derivative of Galatians. Yeah, but it fills in, so to speak, a logic, but I still struggle with it. Being so unique in this Melchizedek discussion.
Yeah.
And frankly, I would have been one, being Pharisaical in nature, who would have said, "No, this isn't part of canon." Just tell you how extreme my reaction was to it.
Yeah.
When I first look at it, and I still struggle with a few books. I don't agonize. I struggle in study with a few of them.
Yeah. And this is all very interesting. My understanding was that Galatians is first. It's one of those first ones. I don't remember where Hebrews fits in, but this is all I agree. This chapter is hard, and it was hard, I'm sure, for the Jews. And one of the points that he's making in this whole book is the Jews were struggling and they were getting persecuted, and they're like, well, we're just going to go back to the law. And he's like, no, you don't want to do that. This is better. Jesus is better. And so this is why he's drawing them back. And I would not be surprised if this whole Melchizedek was something that they really hadn't considered, right? They really probably hadn't thought about. And this is even, if we even take this out, just the Psalms 110, where David says that the Messiah is going to be in the order of Melchizedek, that is something that the Jews probably really weren't considering that much. And so this is one of those things where it would be like, huh, what? And it would take some explanation. It's just really interesting. Yeah. All right. Let's
I
move
wonder
on. Oh,
yeah, the line of kings and the authority and the passing over of authority.
mhm.
You had Saul, who was in the hearts of the people, obviously chosen by God to really give them what they desired, I think. Then you had David. He was not a successor in a line. He was directly appointed by God. There's a similar
Yeah.
relationship there. He's inserted
Yeah.
in all this as Jesus is inserted, or
Yeah.
Melchizedek even. So
There is
just
there is a slight difference there, which I think, which is Saul could have had that line. He could have had a continuing dynasty. God gave him the option of, hey, you follow me and serve me, and I'll make your dynasty continue. And he didn't do that. But this is slightly different because I think from what we see in Psalms 110, which was God's like, no, this is gonna happen. We're gonna have the Messiah is gonna be a priest from the order of Melchizedek, in the sense that it doesn't matter what family he's from. He's coming from this order where it's not based on where your genealogy comes from, which is that is a little bit different.
and I'm sorry you got me thinking that the Jews could have been obedient too.
Absolutely, absolutely.
In
That's
theory.
true. And they could have received the Messiah when he came. That
Yeah.
was that, and some did. Some
Mm.
did, but in generally they didn't know.
Yeah, I hear you.
All right. So here we have this next part of the why Jesus is better as a priest, and this is we're going to hit into these verses here that I enjoy. This is verses 11 through 13. It says, "Therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek, and not be called according to the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed, of necessity there is also a change in the law. For he of whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe from which no man has officiated at the altar." And so I like the point here that if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, what further need would there be? There would, God would be just like, okay, if the Levitical priests were doing everything that they needed to do, and there was no need for anything better, then why would God change it? And why would God have a plan to do something different? And this is the point, which is the Levitical priests, they don't they don't actually provide um, atonement in a real substantial way, right? Even the sin offerings that they are in the ceremony providing for in that offering, in that ceremony, that doesn't last very long. If you sin again, you got to come back, right? Or they have the Day of Atonement where they have the sin offering ceremony for the entire nation of Israel. That only works once a year. They have to keep doing it. And it's not, and part of the problem is the priests are just not sufficient for atonement for the people. And he's gonna again, there's the other issue of they have to constantly offer sacrifices for themselves even. And so this is, I liked we had that last chapter, that cool picture of the priests where they have the rope tied around them, and the people are an anchor for them. They go into the Holy of Holies. If they don't survive, the people have to pull them out. But Jesus is flipped that around, and Jesus is our anchor now. There's still that tie to him, but he goes into the Holy of Holies, and there's no doubt he is good enough as an atonement, and he's our forerunner, and he brings us into that presence with God. And I love that picture there. And that is, again, the same point that the Levitical priests just weren't good enough, but Jesus is. And then he also makes this point again that this order of Melchizedek is going to bring a priest who's going to do these types of ceremonies, bring us atonement, but it's not based on family. He's going to be doing it for the first time of his family, which speaks of Jesus, the Messiah, who comes from the tribe of Judah. There's no Judah priest, right? Before this, there's no priests that come from the tribe of Judah. It's just Jesus.
Oh,
Anybody
I
have
was a
any
little
thoughts?
late. Satan was fooling with my internet.
Oh,
He didn't want me to log on. But the Levites, and that was all about the law. So that's not what God wanted. And so it made sense not to continue down that line of priests, because that was all about the law. And with
Yeah.
Jesus, it's not about the law anymore.
yeah, and again, and I hear, Eric, what you're saying about how even universally we struggle with the law, but yeah, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I was just gonna say, is it that do we struggle with the law in the same way that they struggle with the law? And I was gonna say we don't, but maybe we do, which is they're in this ideology that that's what's going to bring salvation, right? That the law is what's going to bring them close to God. And maybe we
And
struggle with
so
that too.
I think Bill capped it well. But no, I've just seen a person who went, 50 years, 60 years in the Bible, struggle with how to deal with the law. Even studying Galatians, and Hebrews, they couldn't see it, and this was, your heart breaks for somebody who just, that's their focus is I can't figure this out, therefore, oh, I got to figure it out. No, eyes on Jesus, right? First, and then step away. And then another person that was struggling severely. And so, I mean, two people whose, I would say, lives are lost in trying to understand everything, and the law being a key part of that. And
So
if you know the name Rushdoony, who's written many volumes on the law and applicability of it to our lives, and there are Jews still going around trying to convince churches, Christian bodies, to adopt the rituals and to celebrate their feasts and things like that. So I actually, in much the way it was an attack on the Galatians, and they weren't Jews, right? It is very much I'm sorry, and this is why I look at it as a universal thing and not just dealing with the mindset of the Jews. It's a broader mindset. All people want rules. We want it to be black and white. We want to take the heart out of it. We want a recipe, a flow chart, a Venn diagram, whatever the word is. I don't know those charts names anymore.
yeah. So my question to you, Eric, would be is that, do you think that is the same struggle that the Jews had with the law? Because in my mind, the Jews, so let me take one step back. If you go to Israel today and you meet with the Jews, this is my understanding for a lot of Jews, which is they are spiritual just by proximity, just by the fact that they're in Israel, just by the fact that they have their heritage, they have the spirituality associated because of their proximity to these things. And again, Jesus even addresses this to the Pharisees, where they're like, Abraham is our father. We're good because Abraham is our father. And my thinking is that their struggle with the law is not the same as what you're discussing, what you're describing, but it is because of their proximity to the law and the heritage of the law, they are good with God. Not
Okay.
necessarily that they have to follow the law, but just by the fact that it is handed down to them, they're good with God because God gave them the law, which is different than a struggle that we might have, which is, how do I keep all of the commandments and please God? And that's my question. Do you think that that's the same? I'm not sure that that is the same.
They're
Well,
the chosen people. That's their attitude.
That's right.
Well,
and it's I think it's the same human nature intensified with the Jews
Sure.
because of the presumed ownership. This gift became more of a badge, but it's
Sure.
hard for me to even think about Israel and the Jews because there's so few religious Jews there. I
Yeah.
mean, believing, what's the word? Faithful Jews. Wow, I can't even express it. There's very few who focus on God there, and it is, but that's a current thing. So we put the Jews in the context of Hebrews and the audience there. Yeah, I get it. But it's more of a claim of authority than it is a distinction in response, because I think every human heart again just wants an instruction. And did I follow it? Check. Did I do this? Check. Did I not do this? No. Got some work to do here. Of course, I can't get past the very first commandment. But I think I'll be starting to repeat myself, but I still see that this is dealing with every person's heart. Is when you're given the whole Bible, not just the New Testament, how do I deal with it? And this recipe, this answer here in Hebrews and I think stronger in Galatians even, is essential.
Yeah.
That this Old Testament is so important to understand who God is, what sin is, what man has done, and how patient, and the attributes of God and the attributes of people, and the journey, the plan. But you don't cling to it because there's something so new and so much greater that message is so universally needed. Because I'm kind of almost intrigued by the level in which you easily, you're a lifelong Christian, and to you it's a non-issue, and I get that. But what I don't, I mean, I understand that it is not a non-issue to you, but I see it as a common issue.
Sure.
I think there's some nuance there though between the people that, and again, I don't know, I'm just speaking generally, but I think there's a nuance there also in terms of what struggle with the law means, because I think the core issue, I think what the Bible really, in Old and New Testament, when you're talking about Hebrews and Galatians, the centerpiece is justification, right? How are we justified and how are we made or reconciled to God? And I think what the argument of part of the argument of Galatians is, if you go back, not only are you not justified, but you miss the whole point, which is the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And there's this interesting dynamic that when we move on or graduate, if you will, the tutor of the law to bring us to Jesus, it actually makes us a better law-abiding, quote unquote, person. It makes it possible. Whereas if we step back, and that's the argument of Galatians, is like they want it to become better, and they think, oh, we can't put this aside because we got to be better at this. But yet Paul is saying, no, start here, because I mean, people have already talked about earlier, looking at Jesus is actually what makes us able to fulfill the law in ways that we could have never even begun to think about, because it starts at the heart and not at the outward appearance. And I think So I throw that in only because there's some people that get stuck on one side of it, because they can't, oh, what am I supposed to do with this law? But they're actually still stuck with the justification process problem, because they haven't fully grokked the fact that I'm not only righteous before God, but I'm actually free now to obey the law with all my heart. Although I don't do it perfectly, but I don't have to be under that condemnation, because I'm a child of God. Now I'm free to, and of course that's a struggle on its own, right? What's free and what's not free. And, to me, everything is permissible, but not everything's beneficial. And all of that's a different thing. Whereas on the other side, it would be like, once we know we're justified, it's like, Lord, how do I love the Lord your God with all my heart, with all my soul, and all my strength? And the expression of that in the laws you've given. It's like, I don't know how to do that in this case. I don't know how to do that in case. I think that's a different struggle, which is a good struggle, because I think we're being sanctified and considering how God might be changing us from ways that we've always thought about. But now he's extending our love for him and for others in a brand new way that we're like, oh man, I don't even know how to do that. Do I really have to, I mean, you go back to Levitical law, like you said, do I have to, restore fourfold or tenfold if I've really cheated somebody? It's like, no, we don't. But then what if the Holy Spirit is telling you, yeah, you should in this case? It's like a really interesting struggle in that sense. But I think I separate that out, because I think there's a distinction between one and the other. I mean, that's what I was thinking about, Eric, as you were kind of talking through.
Oh, I like it. It's great.
I think that's good. Yeah. And specifically, since we're talking about priests, that I think gives that whole thing a different flavor. Are we talking about justification? Because we're talking about priests, and how are priests involved in the justification process? All of that, and I think that's why I'm pointing out that I think their struggling might be different than our struggle, because for us, the priests were not as involved in our lives as they were in their lives, and so it's just different. But you were right, Eric, and Rich, and that justification side, that is a universal issue that people struggle with. How do I do that? And missing sometimes the point of it's actually Jesus who does that. We need to follow him. And as you said, those other things follow after as we follow him. Eric, you were going to say something. I know
I'm
you
not
were.
sure but something new is that who wouldn't ask if being studying, well, gee, Jesus is not a Levite,
Yeah.
and it's answered here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I, again, without David's comment, that it would feel awfully weak.
If we didn't have David's comment, that would be an issue, right? And that is one of this cool things. And even Jesus says David was in the spirit when he wrote that psalm. That Jesus himself gives authority to it. And it's funny because Jesus is referring to the first part of the psalm when he's having that conversation, but really it's the second part of the psalm that points back to him in a way that we don't expect. And then I think this is this cool aspect of, if we didn't have these chapters in Hebrews, if we didn't have Hebrews, we still would have that Psalm 110, where somebody could make the connection of, hey, the Messiah is supposed to be from this priesthood that's not Levitical. And so there is that cool aspect that God had a provision for it. All right. We do a time check here. Oh, we got 5 minutes. I don't think we have enough time to. I know. Let me just look at the well, I think this is all in the same lines as what we've been talking about. So I'm just going to read verses 14 through 16, and then we'll kind of wrap it up there. There's some cool things that happen in verse 18, and some newish type of things that he's going to bring up that are not this in the same line. They're still in the same line. Anyways, I'm just rambling. Let's just read verses 14 through 16. It says, "For it is evident that our Lord arose from Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning priesthood. And it is yet far more evident if in the likeness of Melchizedek there arises another priest who has come not according to the law of a fleshly commandment, but according to the power of endless life. For he testifies, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And so again, there is this aspect that he's pointing out, and we're gonna talk more in depth about it when we get to the rest of the chapter, which is that Jesus doesn't die. He is, or I should rephrase that, he died and then he came back to life, and now he's alive forever. And so he's a priest, and because he's this priest and he's not going to die anymore, his priesthood doesn't end. And that is very different than the Levitical priests, which they still struggle with, which is cool on itself because it shows us that death is a result of sin, right? And so Jesus, the priesthood that Jesus has here, it has actually conquered sin. He is actually capable of atonement and bringing us into the presence of God in a way that the Levites never did, because they still have that struggle with sin. They're still under the sin. They still die. They still have the consequences of that placed on them. And Jesus is different in the sense that he didn't sin and he took our consequences on himself, and then he died, but he came back and he's never going to die again. So he has this continuing priesthood that is better. It is an eternal, never-ending priesthood, unlike any of the other priests. Again, I mentioned this earlier, you could have some really great priests, but it's only temporary. Whatever they're doing, it's only temporary. You could have some really terrible priests, and maybe you're happy, or you're looking forward to the next priest that's coming. But that's one of the problems that the Levitical priesthood had, which was that they died.
The irony is the Levitical priests are the ones who conspired to put Jesus to death.
Yeah. And
But
again,
he showed
that
his
was
power over them by, his resurrection showed that he is the powerful priest and his order is in control.
That's cool.
and that's one of those crazy things where it is so mind-boggling to me that your relationship with God and your closeness with God is not a requirement to be a priest in that whole system, right? That's just so interesting. And then we have Jesus, who is perfectly close with God, and and so he has this priesthood that is better. It's a good point, Bill.
And of course, another flip thought is they never expected the Messiah to come from the Levitical order.
Yeah.
The recombination of priest and the kingship is a separate subject, I guess.
And because of him coming from the tribe of Judah, because of all of the prophecy related to him and David, there was a focus on the kingship of the Messiah, right? There was this focus on the Messiah is going to come. He's going to set up a government that is going to be different, and we're not going to be oppressed anymore. And when he comes and he does that, and it's not a kingdom like they expect, they totally miss it. And they miss the fact that he's also a prophet. They've missed the fact that he's also a priest. They've missed all these other, they miss that he's the suffering servant who's going to die for the people. And they miss all that because they're focused on the kingship aspect of it, which is great when somebody points out some of these other passages from the Old Testaments about the Messiah. And you're like, oh yeah, he's that too. He's better. Well, we are out of time. And so we will continue this conversation, but the dialogue is going to slightly change in the rest of Hebrews, because he's really been hammering the fact that the Messiah is coming from this, not from Levite or from Aaron, but now he's going to switch gears onto specifically why Jesus is better. He's kind of been touching some of those, but he's going to switch why Jesus is better, and then eventually we'll move away, move to other aspects of why he's better. But good stuff.
So where do you want to pick up next week? I make sure that I'm looking at the right verse to start with.
That is a good question. Probably verse 18.
Okay.
Is where we'll pick up.
And we're going to read all of chapter 8, right? At
Maybe
least.
chapter 8 and chapter 9. Yeah, let's just go through it all.
That's